Hi everyone, and welcome to this evening's PWM Lifestyle event. My name is Andrew Whitewood and I'll be your host for the first part of this evening's engagement. I must say, we are very privileged to have Mr. Izak Odendaal with us this evening. He's the Chief Investment Strategist from Old Mutual Wealth. Izak, it's lekker to have you with us this evening.
Andrew, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Izak. I'd like to take everyone back 30 years to 1994. We had just experienced our first free and fair democratic election in this country, and Nelson Mandela was the president of South Africa. Fast forward to 1995, Nelson stood there with the green and gold on the box. He had number 6 on his back, and Francois Pienaar stood there and rose to the occasion. He stood tall and he lifted the Webb Ellis Trophy aloft, and we were the champions of the world, the rugby world champions for the very first time. Fast forward back to 2024, we have another number 6 who dons the green and gold of the Springboks, Mr. Siya Kolisi. He has galvanized this country over the past 5 to 6 years. But Izak, let us be realistic. The past 10 to 15 years have been very tough for South Africans. We've been brought to our knees by poor leadership and corruption in this country. But once again, another watershed moment in 2024, approximately 6 months ago, where we all went to the polls, we voted, we made our votes count, and the ruling party, should I say, lost their stronghold and their grip on this country. And what that led was to the formation of the GNU, the Government of National Unity. So Izak, please can we unpack the GNU and what is the future of the GNU in South Africa?
Yeah, that's obviously a big question, and I think a lot of people are wondering, and you can think about this from many different angles. So if you just think of it purely from the political angle, and then maybe look at the economic angle. The political angle is simply that South Africa is now in the era of coalitions. It seems very unlikely, miracles do happen, as was the case in 94, but it seems very unlikely that the ANC is going to claw back its majority. Certainly not in the next couple of elections. So it also seems unlikely that any other party is going to grow above 50% of the vote share. So now we are firmly in that era of coalitions at a national level. Obviously, we've had coalitions for a while at local government level, and frankly, they have not always worked that well, which is probably an understatement. So that's the first thing. So this is a big step in our evolution as a democracy. Can these parties work together? Can they be mature? Can they put the country first ahead of their own, kind of narrow interests? And so far, the answer is yes. The immediate response after the election, I think, was a concern that we're going to end up with a coalition that is maybe anti-constitution or very populist. What we've ended up with is a very centrist coalition. A coalition that chose as its guiding principles the Constitution, the rule of law, and I think that's extremely positive. And so far, I think we're about 100 a few days into this GNU, but it's holding. And it's holding despite the fact that there are some very obvious points of tension between the various parties. Obviously, only a few months ago they were bitter enemies, and now they have to be, working together. And there's some big disagreements, right? You can name them. Just yesterday, President Ramaphosa praised Putin, and that's very much against what the DA stands for. The position on Israel and Gaza, very different. NHI, so there are a bunch of areas where these parties don't see eye to eye. But I think they've chosen the route of cooperating, of compromising, and putting the country first.
So, Izak, sorry to interrupt. So, you speak about the Putin comment, you speak also very recently NHR. I think there's going to be, I want you to unpack that in a little bit more detail. There's going to be a lot of noise out there. I think what a lot of people are worried about is we read the stuff in the news, social media, etc. It doesn't mean, I would assume, that actual partnership, as in the GNU, is going to fall to pieces overnight, I would assume.
Yeah, see, you have to remember that a lot of partnerships do fall apart. But if this partnership falls apart, we don't have a government. And I think the parties realize that. The parties realize that if I pull out of this arrangement, where do I go? What do I do? and what happens to the government. So I think there will obviously be a lot of noise, and I think clearly the media will amplify some of the noise. That's just what the media does.
It does, unfortunately.
I think it's also a learning process, right? So these parties need to figure out what is the pain point, what kind of comments are acceptable and what are not acceptable. If the leader of one party says something that is, controversial or makes other partners unhappy, I mean, at what do you break up the coalition just because you're unhappy with this person? So I think they will work through the noise. I think the sticking points will be big policy issues. And again, there, my sense is that they will have to compromise. And I think, luckily, if you think about kind of the person overseeing this whole circus is President Ramaphosa, and I think this is the one thing that he's really good at, right? So in his first term in office, everyone criticized him for not being strong enough, not having a backbone, not being forceful enough. But that was never his style. His style was never to be the strong man leader. I think this is much more suited to his style of compromise, negotiation, bringing people together. So yeah, I think so far it's holding, and I think it'll continue to hold. But I think we must also remember that there will be a couple of key events in the next few years that could put pressure on the GNU. The first is obviously we have local government elections in 26. Now, clearly, if the political landscape completely changes, right? So if suddenly one of these parties gets a lot more votes or a lot fewer votes in the local government elections, that changes the calculus for leadership to say, well, do we need to be in this GNU or not? Or maybe some of the parties outside the GNU do particularly well. And then you could, again, you could see a reconfiguration. And then obviously at the end of 2027, we'll have the ANC's elective conference, at which point President Ramaphosa will cease to be the head of the ANC, someone else will follow there. And so far, when that has happened, the ANC is actually recalled. I mean, the last time with Mbeki and with Zuma, the ANC actually recalled the president, and a new president came into sort of prematurely before the end of his term. So I think that is another point at which the GNU could unravel, and a new configuration could take its place. So I think before we get to the economic side of things, I think the one thought to leave is that we must accept that at some point there's going to be a shuffling, and whether it's 2 years or 3 years or 5 years is very difficult for us to say at this point, but it's something we're going to have to use to, that coalitions kind of form and reform and reshape and reconfigure all the time. If you look at politics in Europe, for instance, I don't think there's a single country on the continent where there's a dominant party, and that hasn't been the case for many, many years. So they're all used to the idea of coalitions and so on. We need to get used to a very different political environment.
So Izak, the GNU is here to stay for the foreseeable future. So from an economic point of view, let's just have a look. It's a bit of a blow to cabinet, but I think there are some ministers that are already gaining some traction. So let's start at Home Affairs. The Minister of Home Affairs recently made some announcements with regards to visas, also sorted out a massive backlog, over nearly 250,000 ID documents. So can we just also focus on that? And I think the purpose of this evening is obviously to focus on positives, right? There really are some bamboo shoots there, and we'll speak to some of the other ministers like Minister of Police, Minister of Agriculture, but let's look Home Affairs, what's happening there? Maybe unpacking a little bit of detail, please, for us with regards to the recent announcement regarding the 2 visas.
So there are 2 very positive things here. The one is the actual work that is happening at Home Affairs, and that is work around, clearing the backlog, as you said, which basically just involved paying people overtime to work over weekends, and they cleared a whole bunch of backlogs of IDs and visas and things that.
Why didn't they do that before, though?
Yeah, there's which brings me to the second point. And the second point is, apart from the specifics of what's happening at Home Affairs, here you have a young, energetic minister climbing into his portfolio, getting things done. And I think that sets an example for other ministers in the cabinet. And it makes it difficult for them to kind of fall back on this culture of, we just kind of do things slowly and there's no rush to do anything. So I think that in itself brings a bit of friendly competition into the cabinet, because obviously when they have these cabinet meetings, and as you said, there are a lot of people in these cabinet meetings, but now suddenly the Home Affairs Minister can say, look, I've done this and this and this, what have you done? And I think it just raises the temperature a little bit. It just kind of probably brings quite a bit of energy to cabinet, which I think was lacking previously. So yeah, sorry.
No, carry on.
Okay, so that's the kind of the point about the functioning of the GNU and the fact that you have now different ministers bringing energy and enthusiasm and I think a bit of friendly competition, which is great. In terms of the big change that happened, and this comes very directly to the economic outlook of South Africa, is to change visa regulations such that, for instance, skilled people can there's now a points-based system. So if you're let's say a German with a doctorate, you're going to score lots of points for your doctorate and you can come and work in South Africa. It's no longer this very cumbersome process of, a South African employer having to prove that there's no local person who can do the job, and then that has to be checked against a database that hasn't been updated for 10 years. And this is just a very simple process, I believe, that follows global best practice, which is to say that if you tick the following boxes, you can come and work in South Africa. And the evidence internationally suggests that if you can bring skilled people into your country, it creates jobs. It doesn't take jobs away from locals, it creates jobs for locals. And I think that's very exciting. And then obviously linked to that is also tourism visas, and we've had a couple of initiatives around, for instance, what they call a trusted tour operator visa. So no longer, for instance, if you want to bring a tour group from China, they all have to go to the embassy and get visas. The tour organizer can arrange that, which obviously speeds things up and simplifies things. And it allows us to tap into, especially India and China, which are obviously massive potential markets for us, that we've up till now neglected because of our very cumbersome visa processes. We want to make it as easy as possible for people to come and have a holiday here and enjoy, and because
spend money,
create jobs. Tourism is something where South Africa has an advantage. We have a very obvious competitive advantage in tourism, but we haven't exploited it fully.
And just going back to the working visa, right? So you're saying that people coming here, they're not going to be taking jobs, to be creating jobs, but what are the other benefits of them actually working in South Africa? So I assume spending money, stimulating the economy, all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely. So two things. One is, let's say that German engineer is coming here, is helping a South African company fix problems to make that company more efficient. So that's good for economic growth. And obviously, as you say, he's going to go home at night, he's going to buy groceries, he's going to pay rent, he's going to employ people. And there's a multiplier effect of that money and those skills coming into the economy. The other visa, there's actually 3 visas. The third visa is what they call the digital swallow, which is essentially you can come and work in South Africa for your international employer. So you're a tech employee from America, you want to come live in Cape Town for 6 months, here's a visa. And again, that person is not earning a South African salary, but they're spending money in South Africa. So I think those are exciting reforms that have been implemented. Now, a lot of these reforms that we'll talk about tonight actually predate the GNU. And I think people will attribute them to the GNU, but a lot of the planning has been done in years before, but they are now being implemented. Partly because, as I said, you've got more energetic ministers in place, but also partly because I think a lot of the processes have now been completed.
So Izak, all of this speaks to kickstarting the economy, right? And I want to flip the focus to the Minister of Police. He has that unenviable task of sorting out SAPs. We see a lot of negative news around these crime syndicates, these so-called mafias, but also he's taken a stance. We've seen a lot of action, for example, against these syndicates and in areas like the Eastern Cape. But are we actually seeing real positive progress, or is this also just a lot of talk and no real push at ground level?
It's difficult to know, and SAPS is a big ship, and to turn around a big ship is difficult. But I think the good news, if you want to take a glass half full view, is that it's been so dysfunctional for so long. I mean, not just the police, but the whole criminal justice system, that small changes, small improvements can actually lead to big improvements. Small improvements here can have a big multiplier effect. I think the other thing that's quite positive is more openness to cooperation with the private sector. So the new minister has already said he wants to work with private security companies. There are many more private security guards than police service staff in South Africa, many more. So that's positive if you can leverage those relationships. And we do see it in some communities. I mean, where I live, for instance, very close cooperation between the local police, the neighborhood watch, the security companies, that works. Whereas the predecessors were very negative about the private security industry. And then also big business coming in and helping set up, for instance, forensics laboratories and so on. So I think that cooperation between big business and government in the security space is also important, because you need top-notch forensics, top-notch investigative capabilities and so on to crack these syndicates. And business can obviously bring resources to the table to get this done. And it's very much in the interest of big business because they are suffering from, or at least some of them are suffering from these syndicates.
And it's like that's obviously a common thread throughout certain ministries or projects in general, right? If you look at government. I think before we move on to Eskom and unpack why we haven't experienced load shedding for over 200 days, let's just have a look at the Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Johan Steenhuisen. I see he was in the headlines very recently. I'm not too sure how much Johan actually knows about farming and agriculture, but I also see there was a big deal that was brokered between ourselves and China, which is obviously very good for the agriculture sector. And I think farmers in general in South Africa, it's very cyclical. They go through a lot of pressures, obviously climate changing, etc. So I think that brings a lot of diversification, in inverted commas, to their farming and agriculture portfolio. So you mind just unpacking that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, I mean, he has been relatively quiet, interestingly, compared to some of his colleagues in the DA. But it's an important portfolio because agriculture is potentially a growth industry in South Africa. There's a lot of areas where we can grow, and there are also a lot of issues that farmers struggle with, and that's particularly around transport, logistics, but also things like European import regulations, and your oranges are don't meet this and that requirement, and they're very fussy around these things. So there's a lot of work that the agriculture minister can do if they are proactive. And I think the important thing is the agriculture minister needs to be an ally of the farming community, the farmers and the farm workers and the rural economies, broadly speaking. And if they can get that right, as I said, agriculture is potentially an area where we can grow, and also it's a big job creator, right? The most labor-intensive sectors are agriculture and construction. Agriculture's done okay in the last couple of years. Construction has really been struggling big time, and obviously those are the sectors where you can create a lot of jobs because almost by definition they're done by people.
So Izak, before we hop into Eskom, I see there's no questions just yet, so just a reminder to everyone to post questions in the Q&A tab within the Zoom app. So yeah, the elephant in the room, Izak, and we were speaking about this prior to obviously going live on air, is Eskom and the actual amazing turnaround of Eskom. But I know, and we know, there's been a lot of hard yards that have been put in at Eskom, but we've had over 200 days without load shedding. When we were planning this event, we usually have to take into consideration load shedding, the stage of load shedding. But yeah, it's been absolutely amazing, and it's so fundamentally important for the South African economy. I think that's a given, and also for growth in this country. So what is keeping the lights on in South Africa?
Yeah, I mean, electricity has been the single biggest issue for our economy for the better part of the last decade. So the fact that we are making progress here is massively important. You cannot run a modern economy without electricity. So what has changed? I think two things. One is, I think at Eskom itself, things are better. I think they've stabilized operationally. They've put the right people in the right places. They've tackled some of the syndicates. They were stealing the coal and then feeding rubbish coal into the coal plants and stealing the diesel and so on. So there are a lot of things that kind of just stabilized a very deteriorating operational profile. And they've got something called the energy availability factor, which is basically how much, you've got all these power plants, but at what sort of capacity are they running?
And at what electricity they're actually producing.
Yeah, so if the kind of the installed capacity is 100 megawatt, for instance, then and you're producing 50 megawatt, then your availability factor is about 50%. Right. So that fell very sharply to around 50%, which is crazy if you think about all these massive power plants in the country, but they're only producing half half of what they can.
Crazy.
And that really is a function of, number one, they were old. So old machines break, as we know, but also, old machines can keep going if they are well maintained. So it's also an issue of maintenance. I think part of the pain we had last year with load shedding was because they were getting maintenance done, and obviously you have to take them offline to do maintenance. So that does seem to have happened, that you've seen that availability factor increase quite nicely into the 60s and into the early 70s, which is very encouraging. But then the other big thing that's happened, of course, is that you've had massive private investment in electricity.
So speaking to renewables, solar, obviously
Yes.
wind. Yeah. So can I just interject and just you're speaking about maintenance. Can we take one step backwards? Let's speak about Coburg Medupi. So I've been reading online over the past couple of weeks that we could potentially experience early stages of load shedding because of maintenance and work that needs to be done. Coburg Medupi units coming online later. Can we unpack that? Have a chat about that?
Yeah. So the bottom line is that things are okay at the moment. As we said, we don't have any load shedding, but obviously, as I said, these are old machines, they need maintenance. Sometimes they break unexpectedly, and sometimes, like Coburg, you have to do planned maintenance. Obviously, you don't want things breaking in a nuclear facility. Medupi and Kusile, unfortunately, even though these are the big new power plants, they were so poorly built that they seem to be breaking down continuously. So yes, we do have to expect that from time to time, Eskom's availability factor will dip. They will have to take plants offline. Unexpected things will happen, and I think that might from time to time lead us to load shedding for a day or two and at low levels. It seems very unlikely that we will go back to where we were a year ago,
Stage 6.
which is like the regular stage 4, 5, 6 load shedding, and we were all on our apps the whole time and planning our lives around when the lights are going to be out and so on. And the reason is because of the second thing that's happened, and that is the private sector. And we're talking about not just the fact that a lot of people have solar panels on their roofs these days, but big utility scale solar projects feeding into the grid, and private companies setting up big wind farms, big solar farms. Just in the last couple of days, a couple of projects in the Free State were announced where you're linking battery storage to a solar plant. Obviously, that helps a bit with the fact the sun does go down every day. And this morning I read about an offshore wind farm that's in the works in Richards Bay. And obviously, that'll take a few years.
Offshore as in the ocean?
In the ocean. And the benefit of an offshore wind farm is that the wind is much more consistent over the ocean than on land. So in Europe, they've got offshore wind farms pretty much anywhere, and these things generate a heck of a lot of electricity. They are massive. These things would be bigger than any building in South Africa. They're like 300 meters tall. But yeah, so that is in the works now, and there are a lot of these projects all over the country. The issue up till now has been grid capacity, because as you can imagine, the electrical grid was built around the coal-fired power stations in Mpumalanga and sort of northern KZN, northern Free State, and then kind of running to the major cities. But the best renewable spots are obviously the Northern Cape for sun and the Eastern Cape for wind.
So actually feeding and connecting into the grid is now almost the biggest problem.
That's a constraint. So what has happened is Eskom has now actually been unbundled into different entities. There's a new standalone transmission company, and their job is going to be to build out the grid to allow for more renewables feeding into the grid as obviously the energy mix in South Africa changes. And that company, because Eskom doesn't have money, by definition is going to have to rely on private funding, and they're going to rely on public-private partnerships, concessions,
but the
etc.
private sector are very willing to partner though, right?
Absolutely.
The way you're saying it, so it's not that the private sector is standing almost on the side and watching all of this roll out and aren't willing to participate. So my understanding is the private sector are very willing to participate.
Absolutely. And the private sector is not just companies, but also investors, right? So if you think about big pension funds, infrastructure internationally is a fantastic asset class to invest in because it gives you a very stable return over the long term. So if you look at the big pension funds in Europe and North America, they love buying an airport, a toll road, a port, power plant, because these things give you very predictable returns over time. So there's a lot of money, I think, that's willing to invest in these projects. The trick is, first of all, you need, from the government's point of view, the willingness to get the private sector involved. And I think that has been the big mind shift that's happened in South Africa. For many years, the idea was that the state must run these things. It was a developmental state. It's a state's responsibility to kind of provide these services and grow the economy through Eskom and Transnet and so on. But we've gotten to the point now where Transnet and Eskom are so fundamentally vulnerable or weak that even, I think, the most ideologically minded politicians realize that we need now private capacity, private know-how, private funding to get involved. And if you do that, you actually grow the economy. And I think, so that to me is if you take a big step back, that's been the big change that's happened in South Africa. And that actually happened before the GNU, because a lot of these reforms predate the GNU, but it tells me that within the ANC, there is this mind shift. And so a new coalition is still going to have, carry this forward, almost irrespective of which parties get involved.
So Izak, Eskom, a lot of bamboo shoots, a lot of positives on the horizon. I think the key thing is you mentioned North America, so I'd like to unpack that in a little bit of detail. If we think electricity, aging infrastructure, we're going to unpack Trump versus Harris a little bit later this evening, but we know what Trump wants to do. He wants to make America great again. He doesn't want to be reliant on the East. He wants to produce chips in the US, but also, once again, all over the media is, can America actually provide the power? And maybe unpack in a little bit of detail what I mean by the state and reliability of power source in order to allow American companies to produce chips and use the equipment reliably to produce those chips in America.
The big issue is actually artificial intelligence, and I think people will be blown away if they realize how much electricity these data centers consume. So I mean, we're talking big numbers, and so just to give you one example, Microsoft signed a deal about a week or two ago to reopen the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. Now those of you with very long memories will remember that in the 1970s, the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania was a scene of a kind of not quite a nuclear meltdown, but it was a big wobble. So it was one of the worst sort of nuclear incidents. So that's why that name will be familiar. But the reason they signed this deal with this company to reopen this plant is to provide electricity for their AI capacity. So in terms of demands on the grid, AI is a big thing. The challenge in other respects is quite similar to South Africa in the sense that they're building offshore wind farms and all these things, but they also need to connect into the grid. They need to connect them, and the problem with across North America and Europe is that people don't really want big electricity power lines going across their terrain. So that's a big obstacle. It's very difficult, from what I've read, in a country like America, to just do a project where we're going to...
It's a vast country, right?
It's a very big country, but just connecting point A to point B is not straightforward.
And then also converting AC to DC. So I'm not an electrical engineer, but also the stability and the conversion. So it seems like it's a very complex process. And I think I'm not trying to deflect, but it's not just South Africa that's facing a challenge when it comes to electricity, to power in general. And it's a problem that the whole world is facing, is going to grapple with going forward. So let's bring things back to South Africa. Okay, so we've spoken about Eskom. Like I said, positive things on the horizon, but I think a big challenge, and a lot of people will see this on the streets and roads of South Africa. We see loads of trucks, we see loads of lorries. A big challenge we're facing, and Michelle Phillips is trying to sort out the problem, is Transnet, right? And once again, the private sector trying to get involved, but there are some hurdles and speed humps. So let's speak about the rail network. I think last time I read, over 20,000 kilometers of railway line in South Africa. We use hardly any of that. And we're trying to get the private sector involved, but that's not happening. Why is it not happening, Izak?
So it's first of all, we started late. So if you think about the reforms that took place in the electricity market, I think we were kind of a year or two behind schedule in the Transnet space. I think we also had leadership at Transnet previously that just wasn't interested. I think the current leadership in Transnet is a lot more interested in getting the private sector involved, partly because Transnet needs the money. I mean, it's I don't want to say they're bankrupt, but they're kind of teetering on the edge. And the reason they are teetering on the edge is because they've got a lot of debt, because they bought a lot of locomotives and things, which they can't use. So they can't earn a revenue to fund that debt or to service that debt. So if they can, get private companies to use their lines, that's at least a source of income. But it's a massive problem. So to just give you some numbers, I mean, Transnet this year, their target for freight volumes is 170 million tons that they want to move. Now that is an improvement from, I think, last year when they did 150 million tons. But in 2018, they did 220 million tons. So we're still well below. We're still well below the kind of the nameplate capacity of our railway system. And then obviously, if you want to grow the economy, you probably want to be moving 250 to 300 million tons a year on the railway lines, because otherwise all that stuff has to go on the roads, which is very, very costly. So there's a lot of work that must be done, and you must just hope that it happens quickly. I think the where we are now is not so much in the kind of the policy terrain or the ideological terrain. It's very much now in the practical terrain of how do you sign. How do you conclude these agreements? What's the pricing that makes sense?
So when could we see private locomotives on national railway lines in South Africa?
I would hope that within the next 12 months. I think that would be fantastic. And you can imagine in some cases it'll be quite simple, right? So if you think of the Sishen iron ore line, I mean that's very much a separate line.
West Coast, right? That runs up and down
the West Coast. It goes from the iron ore mines to Saldanha Harbour. And there's no reason why Kumba Iron Ore can't run their own trains on that line to complement the trains that Transnet are running. Because it was about 6 months ago that Kumba actually announced that they were laying off people because they're producing all this, or they're extracting all this iron ore, but it's heaping up at the mine because they can't get enough of it to the harbour. So there's no point producing more iron ore if you can't get it through to the harbour. And so they've stopped or they've cut back production at the mine, and they've had to let people go. So obviously, if they can fix, have more trains running on the line, they can produce more, create jobs again. So it's a bit of a no-brainer, but I think the working out the technicalities is
a little bit more complex.
It's time-consuming. I mean, remember, Transnet has been in its current form for more or less 100 years.
But right? We're moving in the right direction, though.
We're moving in the right. Yeah, I think in principle. But we need to sort out the practicalities. But I think it'll take time because we haven't done this before. We don't really have a model that you can. That you can,
like a blueprint, right?
You don't have a blueprint that you can copy. Where we do have a blueprint, if I can just sort of jump wildly to the next topic, is the renewable energy procurement process. You'll remember this thing is about already more than a decade old, where the government has bid windows and then companies can bid to put up renewable energy plants. That's a blueprint, and that you can take to other infrastructure types. You can take that to water and say, right, we're going to have a bid window for companies to do bulk water work and bulk water provision, for instance. We can have a bid window for a whole bunch of other infrastructure projects. And just a couple of days ago, exactly that was announced, that the Department of Public Works said we're now going to have a bid window where municipalities and so on can bring projects to the fore, and then we will help to package those projects and sell it onto the private sector. So this stuff is happening, but I think we just need to be patient because it's kind of new to us, and we need to get the process going. It's not just new on the government side, also on the private sector side. I mean, you're going to need specialists in the banks and lawyers and contracts and all that stuff, environmental agency, environmental regulations, and all of that is work that has to go. So infrastructure I think is a big potential growth area for South Africa, but it's not something you just snap your fingers and it happens.
But once again, it's like a lot of positive developments. I'd like us to spend, say, 1 minute on the challenge or the challenges that we're facing at a port level. So you explain now, obviously we mine minerals, get it into a train, plain and simply, and gets all the way to the port, and then we're facing massive delays. Yep. Once again, there's reports online, we've got some of the worst performing ports in the world. What's being done to sort out our ports in South Africa?
So absolutely. I mean, our ports are not great, and the same story. You need maintenance, you need to expand capacity, etc. And there we've kind of one step forward, one step back, right? So the biggest port terminal in South Africa is Terminal 2 in Durban, and I think it handles about 40% of cargo, not commodities, but like boxes, containers. And that port, that was concessioned out to a Philippine company, which is a big step. Again, this thing has been a state run by the state for the last, 100 years. Now they say, let's give it to a private company. They can run it, they can invest money, they can upgrade it and bring their expertise to running this very, very important piece of infrastructure. So that was a hugely positive step, but now the losing bidder has taken this to court, and that's obviously been a delay. And the losing bidder is Maersk, the big Danish company.
Yeah.
So there too, we're seeing progress, but nothing on the ground yet, nothing that's tangible yet.
So once again, Izak, a lot of positivity, bamboo shoots. I see some questions popping up. I don't want to ask those questions just yet. I see the producer saying we've got 10 minutes left, so I think we need to move on swiftly. Let's have a chat about interest rates, inflation. I think one of the other big elephants in the room is the American election, obviously 5th of November, just around the corner. Trump versus Harris, too tight to call, okay? So let's just unpack the US election. I think the key thing that I would like you to explain to everyone on the call today is what will the impact be, for example, if Trump wins or Harris wins? Do things change fundamentally from an economic point of view? What impact will it have on investments, etc.?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is, as you mentioned, I think at this stage it's too tight to call. I think if you look at the polls, it's 50-50. And remember that every poll has a margin of error. So if a poll says Andrew has got 53% support, that actually means Andrew is plus or minus 53%, right? So 50-50 means it's too tight to call. In terms of the different policies, I think a Harris presidency will be more of the same, more or less, right? She was Biden's vice president, so we're going to see quite similar policies.
Hopefully she has a little bit more energy though, but yeah.
Which interestingly would include quite a tough stance on China. So that's the one thing that both candidates share is they're both quite hawkish on China. But yeah, Harris would be more or less a continuity candidate. Trump is as we know, is a kind of different kind of personality. His big thing is, number one, tariffs. He really wants to put big tariffs on China, and he's spoken about 60% or even 100% tariffs. Which means that if you import a pair of shoes from China, they're going to add 40% or 60% to the price of that pair of shoes, right? So they'll make it considerably more expensive. So that obviously means you now potentially, and China and US are the biggest economies in the world, you're now potentially kind of upsetting the whole global trading system. You're now potentially pushing up prices in the US, so that's potentially inflationary. You could cause quite an economic shock if you do that. I don't know if that 60% number, if there's any science behind it, or if that's just a thumbsuck. But I think we should expect that if Trump wins, one of the first things he's going to do is to actually increase tariffs on a broad range of Chinese goods. He's also threatened to just increase tariffs on everybody else. I mean, his mindset is that if I'm importing, that means they're winning and we're losing. So it's a very different understanding to economics than what kind of we get taught at economics at university, which is that trade actually benefits everybody. Anyway, so that's the one thing that I think we must expect. There's going to be some volatility in trade, and if you are running an export business to America at this point, you're probably thinking about what's going to happen if my things become more expensive. The other thing is it depends a lot on not just who wins the White House, but also who wins Congress and what configuration, because there are two houses of Congress. There's the Senate and the House of Representatives. It seems very unlikely that Harris will win, or the Democrats will win the Senate, and that's simply because of the way that those, only a third of Senate votes, only a third of senators are up for re-election in this election. So it seems very likely that the Republicans will win the Senate, and then it's a question of who wins the House, who wins the House of Representatives, who wins the White House. If it's a clean sweep, which looks unlikely in the case of Harris, but possible in the case of Trump, a clean sweep for the Republicans effectively gives them a green light to cut taxes in the US.
Carte blanche, yeah.
Because you need congressional approval to cut taxes. Lower taxes obviously stimulates the economy to an extent, and it's good for company profits, but it means your debt increases. So then we're going to start talking about this, the fact that, and you've mentioned the elephant in the room a few times, but I think the biggest elephant in all of our rooms is, as investors, is just this ballooning US government debt level.
Or global debt in general, right?
Global
US
debt, but specifically US debt, because US debt plays such a central role in the global financial system. I mean, it's actually the bedrock of global markets. So that, I think, would set off a whole bunch of concerns around the stability of US debt. If it's a case of Trump wins the White House, but the Democrats win the House of Representatives, then I think there is stalemate to an extent, and I think markets would like stalemate. Stalemate means nothing changes too much, and we can live with that. So I think from a market's point of view, the ideal outcome is just like as long as you don't have a clean sweep of all these government institutions, it's probably okay.
Izak, I want to hop into some of the questions. So one that I was expecting was the NHR. Okay, now once again, that's another elephant in the room. I think it's a concern for a lot of people, and also from a fiscal point of view, the pressure that it'll put on South Africa. So what do we see? What's the runway like with regards to NHR? Do we expect NHR to place a lot of pressure obviously on the GNU too? And obviously that's a big issue. We do know that within that partnership and agreement. But what does the runway look like with regards to NHR?
The thing is, this is an obvious area where you can compromise, right? Because the NHI is meant to bring the private and public healthcare systems together. So there's lots of room for compromise, there's lots of room to be pragmatic. I think the health minister doesn't see it that way. The health minister has a very ideological view of the world. I don't think everybody in the ANC necessarily agrees with that, because I think they can also see that this is not affordable. So the NHI, as it's currently being presented, is not something we can afford in the short term.
NHS doesn't even work in the UK, right, Izak? So how's it going to work in South Africa?
And to make that jump in a very short space of time, you're going to cause problems. So my sense is that simple fiscal reality dictates that this is a long-term process. We do not have the money to switch this thing on, in the next 5 years, certainly. Once the economy is on a better footing, once debt levels have stabilized, there's going to be a bit more money that we can start putting into some of these initiatives. It's definitely not something that we can afford in the short term, and therefore if you see at next week's medium-term budget that there's a big allocation to the NHI, I think that's going to set off alarm bells. I don't expect to see that, because I think from Treasury's point of view, this is not something that they can implement in the short term, because they know that there's not money for this.
So unfortunately, we've got only time for one more question. So Izak, a view on Petro SA, the secrecy around their tenders, minister's role, Gwede obviously links to Russia.
I think secrecy is the word there. It's a loss-making SOE. It's one of those things that, why do we have it? I don't have more to say on Petro SA. It's one of those examples of, the GNU is not going to solve all our problems. So we mustn't get carried away with the optimism.
Every country.
The main thing is that I think the key issues are getting solved, right? So Petro SA stands or falls or whatever, it doesn't impact the fact that you and I can still buy petrol tomorrow, because you and I buy petrol from private companies. It's those big state-owned entities like Eskom, where we are forced to buy electricity from them, and they don't work. That's where things fall over. Where there's private competition, the same with the post office. Post office can disappear tomorrow. I don't think anyone will notice.
Doesn't impact our
SAA, I don't know if they've been flying or not, but I don't think anyone's noticed.
They have every now and then.
But we notice when Eskom goes down. We notice when Home Affairs doesn't work. We notice when Transnet doesn't work, because the alternatives aren't there.
So Izak, a massive thank you from Private Wealth Management. This evening has been very informative, very, very positive. I think that's the key takeaway from our side. There's lots of positivity, there's lots of bamboo shoots out there. So once again, thank you very much for attending the first segment of this evening's engagement. We're going to take a 5-minute break now. Please, I encourage you to take a leg stretch, and then Jamie and Pitt will be on air. Thank you.